Hey everyone, welcome to this explainer. Look, we're diving straight into an event that absolutely tested the limits of Europe's borders, its humanitarian systems, and its legal frameworks. In late July 2026, tens of thousands of people crossed from Morocco into the Spanish enclave of Ceuta, and they did it primarily by swimming. Today, we're going to strip away the noise and the assumptions. We're looking strictly at what the evidentiary record actually tells us about this historic surge, carefully separating the confirmed facts from the official estimates and the disputed claims right up to our August 1st cutoff. Here is our roadmap for today. We're going to hit the breakwater breach itself, dig into some numbers that really just don't add up, look at a massive Supreme Court shift, explore competing explanations for the surge, touch on the impact on miners and the Schengen zone, and finish with what we still fundamentally do not know. All right, part one, the Ceuta breakwater breach. Let's establish exactly how and when this massive influx actually happened on the ground. This wasn't just a sudden, out-of-nowhere flash. Starting back in mid-July, there was this steady kind of weird uptick in arrivals by sea. By July 29th, Ceuta is already sounding the alarm, saying, hey, our facilities are completely overwhelmed. But the real breaking point, that hits on July 30th. Using heavy sea fog for cover, massive crowds massed in the Moroccan staging town of Finidec and just went into the water all at once. It was so overwhelming that it bypassed both Moroccan security and Spanish interceptors. By the 31st, the situation was so intense that Spain actually had to emergency deploy its military just to reinforce the border. To really understand the how and where of this, we've got to look at the geography. It's essentially a giant funnel. The land border between Ceuta and Morocco is incredibly fortified. We're talking high fences, thermal cameras, anti-climb mesh, the works. Because you really can't cross by land, desperate people are pushed toward the sea. And those land defenses, they just stop abruptly at 2 points. The Tarajal breakwater to the south and the Benzú breakwater up north. So thousands literally swam or waded around these barriers. And let me tell you, this is a seriously dangerous route. You're dealing with jagged coastal rocks and totally unpredictable harsh tidal currents. And that immense danger leads us to a really grim humanitarian reality. As of our August 1st cutoff, the official confirmed count from the Spanish Interior Ministry is 57 fatalities from these crossings. Now, you might have seen a higher number floating around online, specifically 67, from a media outlet called El Español. But we have to be super clear here. That 67 is a provisional media report. It doesn't have named authoritative confirmation right now. So 57 is our confirmed baseline reality, though tragically, there could definitely be more unrecovered victims out there. Moving on to Section 2, numbers that do not reconcile. This is where things get really messy between what is being claimed and what is actually proven. Just look at the sheer scale of this and notice the massive gaps in what we know. Spain officially estimates around 50,000 arrivals in just a crazy, highly concentrated 24-hour window. But then Ceuta's regional government claims it was up to 60,000 over a multi-day period. After that, we have official claims of 48,300 returns back to Morocco, and on top of it all, an estimated claim of about 7,000 unaccompanied minors currently sitting in Ceuta. These are mind-boggling numbers, right? But remember, they are official estimates and claims. We absolutely do not have a unified person-by-person verified data set for this. Which brings us to a glaring void in the record. The Spanish government claims an aggregate total of 48,300 returns, supposedly done through tight bilateral coordination with Morocco. But NGOs and legal experts are throwing up massive red flags. Why? Because the paperwork just isn't there. We have no idea about the composition of these returns, like who went back voluntarily versus who was administratively removed. The specific individual procedural records are completely missing from the available data, and without those records, you simply cannot independently verify the legality of tens of thousands of returns. Okay, Section 3, the Supreme Court legal shift. This is the absolute legal pivot point that turned a massive crisis into an administrative nightmare. Here is the wild thing about this border law. It literally changes depending on where your feet are. At the terrestrial land fence, thanks to specific provisions for Ceuta, authorities can use immediate border rejections, often called hot returns. Basically, cross the fence, get sent right back. But in the water, it's a totally different story. People intercepted at sea cannot be immediately rejected. They legally have to go through a full, individualized standard procedure. So why the massive difference? Well, it all hinges on a ruling from the Spanish Supreme Court, Judgment 814/2026, which dropped just weeks before this surge. The court basically ruled that expedited hot returns only apply if someone is trying to overcome a physical containment element, like a giant metal fence. The court explicitly said the sea inherently lacks a physical barrier. Even if you've got thermal drones or sensors buzzing over the water, that technology isn't a physical wall. Because of that, anyone caught in the water hasn't bypassed a physical element, so they are protected from immediate rejection. So, if you can't do a hot return, what happens? The authorities have to use this highly meticulous standard procedure. We're talking a strict 72-hour processing window, mandatory access to a lawyer, providing an interpreter, and giving them a formal opportunity to request asylum. Now think about that. Try applying that resource-heavy step-by-step process to 50,000 people arriving in a single 24-hour period. It is literally a logistical impossibility. It totally paralyzed the system and created a severe bottleneck right there on the beaches.
That leads us to Section 4, competing explanations for the surge. Basically, why did this massive mobilization happen exactly when it did?
The truth is, we don't have one single smoking gun here. Instead, we have three very different theories. First up, the official Spanish stance. They claim human trafficking networks purposefully weaponized social media to spread misinformation about that new Supreme Court judgment. Then you have the humanitarian stance, which argues this was totally organic, driven by crushing socioeconomic despair and persistent youth unemployment over in Morocco. Finally, there's a disputed geopolitical stance, with some opposition figures suggesting Morocco actually orchestrated this for diplomatic leverage. But let me be clear, that theory lacks documentary evidence and is actually heavily contradicted by verified footage showing Moroccan riot police using water cannons to try and hold the crowds back at Fenidic. And we really need to be careful not to mix up correlation with causation here. Did that Supreme Court judgment narrow the rules and put insane pressure on the border agencies? Absolutely. But did it directly cause the surge? We just don't have the proof for that. You have to look at the legal shift as just one piece of a giant puzzle, right alongside severe structural poverty, digital rumors, and physical enforcement capacity. All right, Section 5, minors, borders, and Schengen. Let's zoom out and look at the immediate shockwaves this sent across Europe. Look at this number, 7,000. That is the estimated claim for how many unaccompanied minors arrived during the crisis. Why is this a total game changer? Because legally, you cannot deport unaccompanied minors. You just can't. The state is rigidly bound to protect and house them. The catch? Ceuta's local reception centers were already at 2,400% capacity before this even happened. So you have an instant humanitarian emergency that creates massive political headaches all the way in Madrid, as the government desperately tries to negotiate moving these kids to other autonomous communities on the mainland. And this pressure didn't stay local. It immediately started fracturing Europe's internal cohesion. Over in Italy, the interior minister actually passed a formal decree putting temporary internal border controls on non-EU nationals arriving by air or sea from Spain. We also saw one media outlet report that France was beefing up its land-border checks, though we have to treat that as unverified since no independent government source confirmed it. The tension got so high that the EU Migration Commission stepped in, announcing that Spain assured them everything was contained and no irregular secondary movements into the European mainland had happened. Finally, Section 6. What remains unknown? Because as of our August 1st cutoff, we have to respect the boundaries of what we still just don't know. Take Spain's proposed infrastructural response, for example. The government announced a plan to install physical maritime buoys in the water off Ceuta. The thinking is, hey, maybe a line of buoys counts as a physical containment barrier, which would let them go back to those immediate hot returns in the water. But honestly, that is purely an untested legal gamble. Whether floating buoys can actually satisfy the rigorous standards of that Supreme Court judgment is entirely unresolved. So, what are we still missing from the evidentiary record? Quite a bit, honestly. We still don't have the person-by-person procedural paperwork to prove those 48,300 returns were legal. The final official fatality count might still change. And a single proven reason why this all kicked off is still a matter of competing theories, not hard fact. Ultimately, as Europe looks ahead, the Ceuta crisis leaves us with one massive unresolved question. When absolute legal frameworks crash head-on into an overwhelming humanitarian reality at the border, which one ultimately has to break? That wraps up our explainer. Thanks so much for joining me to break this all down.